This courtroom is an appropriate setting for discussing the case for Christ. In other words, is there any credible evidence that Jesus Christ was telling the truth when he made the audacious claim that he is the one and the only Son of God? And does that evidence stand up to the kind of scrutiny to which it would be subjected in a courtroom like this one? Well, that's what we're going to be discussing as we talk about the contents of my book, which is called The Case for Christ, a journalist's personal investigation of the evidence for Jesus. Now I want to begin talking about that investigation by discussing with you a case that I covered in a courtroom very much like this one when I was a legal affairs editor of the Chicago Tribune. The case involved a defendant by the name of James Dixon, and he was accused of attempted murder for shooting a Chicago police officer. The case is a very interesting one. James Dixon had gone to his girlfriend's house. He was arguing with his girlfriend's father through the front door of the home, and somebody called the police. A sergeant by the name of Richard Scanlon arrived on the scene. The father of the girlfriend came out of the house, and he got into a fist fight with James Dixon. The police officer got in the middle of the two to try to break him up, and then all of a sudden, a shot rang out. The police officer was wounded. Right then, another squad car pulled up, and they handcuffed James Dixon. Now, the police believed that they had an incredibly tight case against James Dixon. They had a lot of evidence. First of all, they found his gun a short distance away where he had apparently thrown it. That gun had his fingerprints all over it. There was one bullet missing from that gun, and the gun was registered to James Dixon's name. What's more, Sergeant Scanlon's gun had never gone out of its holster. And the father of James Dixon's girlfriend wasn't armed at all. In addition, there were powder burns on the skin of the police sergeant. That indicates that he was shot at incredibly close range. In addition, when they ran a background check about James Dixon, what they found is he had been accused and convicted once earlier of shooting somebody else. So he apparently had a history of violence. In addition to that, after awaiting trial for a year in the county jail, James Dixon finally pleaded guilty. He admitted it. He said he did it. Now, they thought they had a great case against James Dixon. And I did too. As a reporter, I remember walking out of the courtroom saying, well, that's not much of a story. The police sergeant recovered from his wounds. It's an open and shut case, maybe 3 paragraphs in the Chicago Tribune. But I was very wrong. Because the next day I got a phone call. And that phone call was from an informant of mine. And he said, hey, Lee, do you know the James Dixon case? I said, yeah. He said, you know, I think there's more to it than you're giving it credit for. I said, what do you mean? He's clearly guilty. It's nothing case, open and shut. He said, no. He said, recently, Sergeant Scanlon was seen at a party with a pen gun. I said, what's a pen gun? He said, well, a pen gun is sort of like a fountain pen, except it's really a .22 caliber pistol. They're illegal for anybody to carry. And I said, well, what's that got to do with anything? He said, Lee, don't you get it? Sergeant Scanlon had the pen gun in his pocket. While he was struggling with James Dixon and the other man, the pen gun went off and it wounded him. Now, he didn't want to be caught with an illegal gun, so he falsely accused James Dixon of shooting him. And I said, that's preposterous. And my informant said, Lee, check it out yourself. See where the evidence points. And that's what I began to do. I began to check out the case from a whole different perspective. And I found some very interesting things. First of all, I found a witness who said that before the police had arrived, James Dixon had been pounding on the door with the handle of his gun, and the gun had gone off. In fact, I also found a fresh chip of cement from the little stoop there of the house that showed that a bullet had indeed ricocheted off of it. Well, that would account for the missing bullet. Secondly, I found another witness who said that he had seen James Dixon take the gun and run across the street and hide it before the police arrived. That would explain how it ended up way over there. The police assumed he'd somehow thrown it, but nobody had seen him throw it. Third, the powder burns on the police sergeant. They were concentrated inside the pocket, at the bottom of his pocket. Well, that says that somehow a gun had gone off inside his pocket. The police report also said that he was shot by a bullet that went sort of lateral. But what the evidence showed is that the bullet trajectory was downward, through the bottom of the pocket, and it went through some flesh before going into the ground, and they never quite found it. What's more, when we investigated the background of James Dixon, we found that, yes, he was convicted of shooting somebody else. He spent time in prison doing that. The problem is, he was later let go by the appellate court. Why? Because he'd been innocent. Well, that started to shed some new light on the case. But it left one important question. If James Dixon was really innocent, why did he admit that he did it? Why did he plead guilty? Well, I went to James Dixon and I asked him that question. This is what he told me. He said, I had awaited trial in jail for a year. And here was the deal the prosecutors offered me. They said, if you admit that you shot the police sergeant, then we'll let you go with time served. In other words, we'll sentence you to 1 year in prison. You already served your year in prison. You can go home. But if you insist on a trial and a jury finds you guilty, we're going to sentence you to 20 years in prison. So James Dixon said, I didn't have a choice. It was either lie and admit that I shot the police sergeant and go home, or go to trial, maybe be convicted, and then spend 20 years in prison. So he said, I admitted something that I hadn't done. Well, I published these articles in the Chicago Tribune, and as a result, James Dixon was exonerated. The police sergeant was indicted, and he later pleaded guilty to official misconduct and was thrown off of the police force. But most important, I learned some very important lessons as a young reporter. First of all, I learned that the evidence could be made to point in more than one direction. Yes, you could align the evidence and show that James Dixon was, quote-unquote, guilty of shooting the police sergeant. There was enough evidence to find him guilty and to send him away to prison. The problem was he didn't do it. These were the questions that needed to be asked. Was the collection of the evidence really thorough? And secondly, which explanation best fit the evidence? Well, no, the collection of the evidence had not been really thorough. And secondly, when you had all of the evidence, the best explanation was that the police sergeant had been shot by his own pen gun, not that he was shot by James Dixon. Well, why am I telling you this? What has this got to do with the case for Christ? Well, the story of James Dixon has sort of some parallels to my own spiritual journey. See, for most of my life, I was an atheist. I thought that the idea of an all-powerful, all-loving God was just an absurd idea. I thought that it was just wishful thinking by people. I thought that Jesus, if he ever lived, was probably a very nice man who probably taught some very interesting things, but he certainly wasn't the Son of God and probably never claimed to be. Where did I pick up this kind of opinion? Oh, from here and there, from professors in school who taught me that evolution explains where life came from mothers who would talk to me about the legends of Jesus and mythology in the Bible and things like that. Had I thoroughly investigated the evidence? No, not really. Plus, I had some personal motivations for there not being a God. I'd been living a very immoral lifestyle, and I would just as soon rather there not be a God to hold me accountable for the kind of things that I was involved in. But then something happened, just like the whisper of an informant in the James Dixon case. Something happened in my life that triggered a new investigation. In this case, it was something that happened to my wife, Leslie. Leslie came to me one day and she said, you know what? I've decided to become a follower of Jesus Christ. And I thought, oh no, this is the worst possible thing that could happen to our marriage. I figured she was going to turn into some sexually repressed prude who was going to spend all her spare time at some soup kitchen serving the poor somewhere. I thought, this is an awful development. And I said, you know what, if you want to believe in a make-believe God and put your trust in a book of legend and make-believe, you go ahead and do that. But don't try to get me involved, because I'm too smart for that. But then over time, I began to see changes in Leslie, very positive changes in her character and in her values. And so I began to investigate the case for Christianity. I began to use my legal training and my journalism training to systematically investigate, could there be any evidence that substantiated the claim that Jesus Christ really is the one and only Son of God? I spent a year and 9 months of my life investigating that very issue, interviewing experts, checking other kinds of evidence, a year and 9 months of my life, and I've retraced that spiritual journey, including the evidence that I found compelling in my book, The Case for Christ. And in these next installments, I'm going to talk about the evidence that I found personally persuasive. And I'd like to ask you to serve in the role of a juror. What does a juror do? A juror promises to be impartial, to listen to all of the evidence, not to have any preconceived notions about how it should come out one way or the other. They promise to use their common sense, their thinking process, to evaluate the evidence and come to the conclusion. Does it make sense? Does it add up? To go back to the James Dixon case, has the collection of evidence been thorough? And secondly, what's the best possible explanation for that evidence? Those are the kind of questions I'd like you to ask yourself as you listen to the evidence for the case for Christ. I'd like you to come to your personal verdict in terms of whether you think that Jesus Christ was telling the truth when he made that audacious claim to being the one and the only Son of God. Where do you begin an investigation like this? Well, anybody trained in journalism and law will tell you that you begin by asking this question. How many eyeballs are there? What does that mean? Well, that's slang for how many eyewitnesses do you have? Do you have anybody who actually saw this person, Jesus Christ? Did anybody listen to his teachings? Did anybody see his miracles performed? Did anybody see him when he supposedly was resurrected from the dead? And if there were witnesses, did they write down what they encountered? Well, next time when we get together, we're going to look at the question of, are there eyewitness accounts that are trustworthy about the life, the teachings, the miracles, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ? So we're going to take a recess now. And when we come back, we're going to look at the eyewitness evidence in the case for Christ.